But the campaign continued, and there were something like 60 engagements that began the next day and continued for about 3 months. And the American Army was taking the initiative in nearly all of them. They got control of the tempo. They were taking the initiative away from the British commanders. And at the end of it, the American Army was gaining in strength, and the British Army had suffered very heavy losses. They were greatly reduced in the number of their effectives. By the end of that forage, it was called the Forage War. By the end of it, in March, the British were driven almost totally out of New Jersey. Most of the state had been recovered by the Americans. The cause had not only survived, but begun to grow again. Our man in Paris, who was then Benjamin Franklin, began to spread the news. He also spread the reports of what he called the soldier trade, and compared it to the slave trade, the soldier trade in the Hessian army. And the Americans were beginning to get control of the news, of the press, of these events, as well as of the events themselves. All of this did not win the revolution, but it kept the revolution from failing, kept it going, and it would go for a very long time, altogether longer than the American Civil War and our service in the World War II combined. That was the length of it. There were many very dark and desperate moments, but that there was this new system of an army that was made up of free men, that was led in a new way, that began to take advantage of new opportunities. How Washington did that, I would say, if there's one word that would describe what he did in his councils of war, it would be that he listened. He was a listener. And it made all the difference in the way these things worked. He also, in that policy of humanity, he was aligning the values of the American Revolution to the conduct of the war. And it began to appeal to the imaginations of many people all around the world, even Washington's opponents. George III was touched by some of these things in unexpected ways. When, long after the American Revolution, George III went mad, one of the forms of his madness was to imagine that he was George Washington. And we can see something of the moral ascendancy that was beginning to happen. These men took advantage of their opportunities. They learned to do that in that much more open a way. They were very skilled, for example, at using the weather. The weather was miserable through it all. And they turned the weather to their advantage in almost each one of those campaigns. There was an old Yankee saying that some folks are weather-wise and some folks are otherwise. The American councils were weather-wise. The British councils were otherwise. And it made a difference. They learned to move quickly. It was a relative idea of speed. But General Howe said, explaining why things were going so desperately wrong, that he said, the Americans moved with more celerity than we. More celerity meant 2 miles an hour, as against perhaps 1, but it made the difference. And all of this went on in one campaign. The amazing thing to me is not that any one of these things happened, but that all of them happened together. All of them were improvised under extreme pressure and great difficulty. We think of 1776 in terms of glory and achievement. The people who were living and leading there spoke of it and remembered it as the black times of 1776, as Tom Paine called it. Robert Morris wrote to George Washington, and he said, "Thank God this year is over." He said, "I can't imagine a worse one." And George Washington agreed. And yet, in the midst of all of that, they transformed these events, and I think transformed our history. And that's something to remember. Thank you.